It's time for the Daily Stand Up Podcast presented by AgileDad with your host, Lee Henson. Without any further ado, let's get started. Hello, everyone. I thought now would be a good time for us to talk about a topic that I heard a lot this past week. I had a whole bunch of folks talking to me about the experiences that they've had where they find that their teams have been just carrying over work from one sprint to the next forever. That it seems like they can never get ahead, that every time they do sprint planning, they're always carrying something over, or that the team is consistently signing up for too much work, or even better, that the team signs up for a set amount of work and they don't complete it. So the question becomes, how do we get teams to the point where they can commit to and complete the work that they sign up for? And I think that this is going to be a no brainer, but at the same time, I think it's good to have a discussion about it because I don't think people are executing in this way. So, for starters, when teams sign up for work, one of the things I encourage them to do is to make sure that they're not trying to use time based estimation practices. Now, there are multiple podcast episodes on here where I discuss this very topic about why it's so important to not use time based estimation and give you lots of alternatives of things you can do instead of time based estimation. But I still feel like, for whatever reason, people like to try to tie things to time. They'll say, a story point equals a day or a story point equals 8 hours. And what this does is it not only causes confusion, but it causes frustration because I sense that people don't want to be tied to a strict timeline. Because asking someone how long something's going to take is a flawed question right out of the gate, right? So if we're asking people how long things are going to take, we're destined to get an incorrect estimate to begin with. And as a result, we get people to be overly optimistic. And then what happens is they end up overcommitting to the amount of work they can do. And as a natural effect, the team never finishes and work carries over from one sprint to the next. Thereby, leadership and everyone else feels the team's ineffective, or that they're not good at estimation, or that they're incredibly not predictable. And it winds up causing the team to lose a lot of credibility. So, as a result, we end up breaking apart those teams, creating different teams, adding people to the teams, extending sprint lengths, spending more times in meeting trying to define stuff, trying to break things down super duper granular, and we end up worse than what we were before, right? So this is a big symptom, and I see it happening all the time. So the key to getting this right is actually shocking and simple all at the same time. When a team goes to sign up for work, I always ask them, don't try to figure out how long this is going to take. Figure out what the right workload looks like. We can use story points to figure it out as long as story points are not equated with time. And once we figure out what the right workload looks like, I'm like, great. Now take one item out and we're going to sign up for that amount of work minus one item. And when people hear this, they're often shocked. They're like, why do you take out an item? And I'm like, well, I want to know with confidence that the team is going to finish everything that they commit to. I want the team to become predictable. Because what I found is that if teams are predictable, oftentimes they'll finish the work that they say they're going to complete in the sprint. And if they were correct with their estimates, they'll have a little bit of bandwidth to pull in an extra item and perhaps get that item done as well. Where I find that teams that try to fill their sprints to the brim are the ones that are always carrying things over. They're always deemed not predictable. They spend more times in meetings. And then they end up having to either increase their sprint length or they get forced to think about all the minutia, and it doesn't help the cause. It doesn't help them do things better. In fact, if given that option, I would argue that it hinders the team's ability to do well. So we need to figure out a better way. So if we're going to stop work from carrying over from one sprint to another, I have 3 tips. The first tip is figure out how much work the team can fit in a sprint and take one item less. If the team does this, they're going to, in essence, underestimate and overdeliver. But at the same time, if it gets to the end of the sprint and there's still some bandwidth left, it is okay for the team, perfectly okay for the team, to pick up an item from the next sprint and begin working on it. Now, one of the tips that I give to the team is do not pull that item into the current sprint unless you completely finish it before the end of the sprint boundary. If you do not finish it before the end of the sprint boundary, what that means is next sprint you'll have a head start on that first item, and by the end of that sprint, your velocity will have increased because you'll be able to pull in an extra item and finish it that sprint. If you do finish the item in a current sprint, sure thing, pull it in, mark it as done, and add those story points to your team's velocity for the current sprint. I guess what I'm trying to say is, in order to become predictable, You need to live with the fact that the team can only finish a certain amount of work, and that sometimes that the team's estimate is not perfect, and that they're doing the best they can, and we need to give them a little bit of leeway to get better over time. Yes? Okay. So now that we understand this first principle for not carrying over work, let's talk about the second principle for not carrying over work. And that has to do with handling of interruptions. I think more times than not, organizations don't know how to handle interruptions. So they let the interruptions come in. This causes context switching. Context switching means that there's no such thing as multitasking. So context switching means that an individual is going to disengage from what they're currently working on, initially put some initial thought or forefront thought process into what do I have to do next, and then they're going to try to re-engage and go back to doing what they were doing before. Right now, this interruption may seem pretty trivial, but if you take the team and say each sprint the team's going to dedicate 20% of their time to working on debt, or every time something comes up, we're just going to let that interruption happen with the team, but don't worry, we'll pull a backlog item out. What you're going to quickly find is that the team is going to become overwhelmed, and they're not going to finish the work, and they're not going to be predictable. And almost always, you're going to carry things over from one sprint to another. And part B of this equation is I often hear teams say, well, we're going to tell everybody to spend 20% of their time this sprint or 15% of their time each sprint working on outstanding defects or technical debt. And the secret here is it's not going to help. If you don't have set items that you're going to finish as part of your sprint goal, and you just want people to spend quote unquote a pre-allocated amount of time doing something, you're going to find that the team is going to fall short more times than not, because they will either dedicate too much time towards working on the debt or the additional items, and they won't spend enough time focusing on the work they've committed to during the sprint. Or the team will do the opposite. They'll finish all the work during the sprint. They'll look great. You go to ping them and realize that they're not living up to the standard of what they committed to, or that the team is finishing the work, but the debt is looming and it's outstanding, and either way, the team is not going to be finishing part of their sprint goal. It's not going to work for them. What's going to happen is by pulling in this extra work or allowing interruptions, the team's either not going to finish the correct things, they're going to allocate way too much time or way too little time, and you're going to see the debt either dramatically increase or the debt get addressed and work carry over from one sprint to the next. And once again, that's going to cause micromanagement. It's going to cause the teams to really have the covers pulled off, and everybody's going to see exactly how operationally things should be happening or will be happening. And then my third tip for avoiding carrying work over from one item to the sprint, or one item to the next in a sprint, you don't want things to carry over from one sprint to the next, is to make certain you build an organization with some type of psychological safety in place, and that teams feel like they can express themselves using radical candor communication, that they're not afraid to be truth and honest, that there's no harm in saying no if they really can't do something, that they're not going to be judged, that they need to be able to say no comfortably and then say, but this is what I can do, or this is what we can do to work together. And I think that sometimes teams lose sight of the bigger picture because they're so macro focused on the needs or the goals for specific items. And what happens is when we plan to this nth level of detail, just like we're discussing in our last or in our last podcast episode, is that when they plan at that level of detail, they often go too far, become micromanaged, have too many tasks, work expands, and they end up carrying things over from one sprint to the next. So my advice is keep it simple. Don't let work get out of control, and find creative ways to finish the things you committed to. And if you do, you're always going to be blessed to have more. That's going to do it for this episode of the Daily Stand-Up Podcast. I hope that you got a lot out of it. This is just going to be a powerful, powerful, short, sweet episode to help you really understand how not to carry things over. And I promise you, if you do these things, that wow, you're going to see results. And as always, I encourage you to stay healthy, stay well, and stay agile, my friends. Until next time, do take care.